We begin this module by again returning to the internal rate of return decision rule. We concluded in that module that for independent projects where all of the project's negative cash flows precede its positive cash flows, the IRR rule will give the same decision as NPV. In this module, we'll focus on this clause in the rule. These are the cash flows for the project where we calculated the net present value in the NPV module. As we can see here, the only negative cash flow precedes all of the positive cash flows. Another way of stating that is that there is only one change of sign as we move from left to right. And this was the NPV profile for that project. The NPV profile crosses the horizontal axis in one place, and by definition that is the internal rate of return for the project. Let's make a slight change to the cash flows for this project. Instead of a positive cash flow of $28 in year 4, we have a negative cash flow of $10. This is often the case where a firm has to spend money at the end of the project to dismantle some sort of equipment or repair the environment to what it was before the project started. This is an example of the clause that we highlighted earlier. It is not true to say that all of these projects' negative cash flows precede its positive cash flows. Here is a negative cash flow that occurs after the positive cash flows. Another way of stating that is that there are two changes of sign, from negative to positive and then from positive to negative. When we have cash flows like this, where there are negative cash flows after positive cash flows, or there are multiple changes of sign as we move from left to right, it is possible that there will be no internal rates of return, or there will be multiple internal rates of return. And that makes decision making extremely difficult with the IRR rule. If we graph the NPV profile for these cash flows, we get a line that does not cross the horizontal axis. There are no internal rates of return for this project. Let's consider this project. Again, we have two changes of sign, from negative to positive and then from positive to negative. And we find that the NPV profile crosses the horizontal axis in two places, at 10% and 40%. There are two values that satisfy the internal rate of return equation. In fact, the number of changes of sign in a project's cash flows indicates the maximum number of internal rates of return that we could get. In this example, the project has a positive NPV for internal rates of return between 10 and 40%. For example, if the cost of capital was 20%, we have a positive NPV and this project should be accepted. If the cost of capital is less than 10% or greater than 40%, then we'll have a negative NPV and it should not be accepted. It may be possible to determine mathematically that this project has two internal rates of return at 10% and 40%, but we can't necessarily conclude that for any cost of capital between these values, the project should be accepted. It's possible that an NPV profile could look like this. We have the same values for the internal rates of return, but now this project should be accepted if the cost of capital is less than 10% or greater than 40%. Here's another set of cash flows where it is not true to say that all of the negative cash flows precede all of the positive cash flows. In fact, we have three changes of sign, from negative to positive, from positive to negative, and then back from negative to positive. And if we graph the NPV profile, we do indeed get three internal rates of return. We've seen over the last two modules why these clauses exist in the internal rate of return rule. If we have independent projects and all of the negative cash flows precede all of the positive cash flows, then we'll get the same decision between internal rate of return and net present value. However, these two clauses represent weaknesses of the internal rate of return method. If we are dealing with mutually exclusive projects that are of a different scale, then we may get an incorrect ranking and therefore make the wrong decision. And if we have a project where negative cash flows come after positive cash flows, we may get zero or multiple internal rates of return, which is clearly impractical for decision-making purposes.